Welcome to America's Commercial Real Estate Show, your source for market intelligence, forecasts, and success strategies. Hello, I'm Michael Bull. Hey, we really appreciate you being with us, whether you're on YouTube, iTunes, one of the radio stations around the country, or the show website, creshow.com. This segment is brought to you by Bull Realty, commercial real estate, asset, and occupancy solutions. Visit bullrealty.com. Well, we have an interesting show for you today. We're going to talk about commercial real estate lending trends 2017. Now, this is a report that's just come out from the National Association of Realtors, and it's a great report. We'll put a link to the website on the website page for the show so you can read the report if you like. And please welcome my guest. It's George Ratiu. He's Director of Quantitative and Commercial Research with the National Association of Realtors. George is joining us on Skype. George, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Michael. It's very good to be here with you.
And if you could start us out with volume of sales and what's happening in commercial real estate, and then we'll kind of talk about what's happening on the lending side, because it certainly impacts the business, doesn't it?
You're absolutely right. And in fact, we've been in a very interesting market environment over the last year and a bit. As commercial real estate sales, we've watched the volume after a nice ramp-up period over the 2010-2018 period. We watched the sales volume actually begin in 2016, both globally. So global investments were down by double digits, but in the U.S., investment sales volume was also down in each of the 4 quarters, including this last quarter, the first quarter of 2017. Interestingly, that does not necessarily apply the same way across the entire valuation spectrum. We've, in fact, as you know, we've have large cap markets generally aggregated at $2.5 million and higher per transaction, and then we have small cap markets below that threshold. A lot of times secondary, tertiary markets. Deal volume in smaller markets, in fact, in 2016, had very good trajectory. In essence, based on our data, we saw sales volume increase with each successive quarter. However, 2017 first quarter, we saw the first year-over-year quarterly decline, where small cap sales volume dropped by a little over 4%. So the markets which have been diverging for the better part of 2016 seem to be converging at the beginning of 2017. It remains to be seen if that is just a one-quarter instance or if that trend continues.
Hey, what do you think is impacting these sales volume changes?
Well, I think there are, in essence, 2 factors. One is obvious that on a macro scale, a lot of commercial investors have, in essence, hit the pause button. So they are taking a look at global economic slowdown. They're looking at uncertainty. And this last year, specifically for the U.S. investors, obviously the presidential election provided quite a bit of uncertainty. With the election in November, a lot of that uncertainty subsided. However, we've had at least a quarter and a bit of expectations not being met on the part of obviously the administration, legislative activity, and so on. The other main factor that I would point to is inventory. And we know that in some of the top markets, there's been a shortage of inventory, particularly in Class A space. But even in small cap markets where we survey our own members, we ask them, what's your number one concern? And they've been noting an inventory shortage for at least a year and a half.
And is that inventory shortage more related to residential or commercial?
This is, well, we actually have obviously an inventory shortage on both ends, but I've been mostly addressing commercial. Right. So we obviously have about 70,000 commercial members whose primary specialty is commercial, and it's those members who have been having to work through this inventory shortage problem as much as obviously the residentials have.
Okay. And George, how much are the regulatory changes that kind of came in last year, especially for the banks, impacting maybe the slowdown or impacting commercial real estate lending?
Well, I think in the small cap space, that's particularly an issue. And you're right, you pointed out high volatility commercial real estate regulation that came out of Basel III was implemented, which actually requires banks to hold 150% of their loans made for commercial real estate, particularly the ADC loans, construction and development. So I think that in and of itself is impacting some of the activity, especially in small cap markets. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning is the fact that with lending and debt financing for commercial deals in small markets making up the bulk of financing sources, regulators' scrutiny of banks' balance sheets has added another layer of uncertainty. And in a sense, it seems that a lot of examiners are applying some of the rules from the Dodd-Frank Act, which were designed for large institutions and large banks, just as strictly to smaller banks, local, community, and regional banks. And given the public comments made by the Federal Reserve over the past year about the fact that commercial real estate seems to be overheated, it's obvious that regulators have been paying very close attention to commercial loans, which it turns out from our members' responses is actually impacting investment volume.
Do you expect any changes with these regulations with a new administration in place?
So we obviously have had the administration publicly express an interest in tapering some of the regulatory burden. We're yet to see some of that translate on the financial side in actual changes. But we have also heard from the regulators themselves, the FDIC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Treasury. They've released statements this year recognizing the fact that Dodd-Frank has placed undue burden, particularly on the smaller banking institutions. And they did express, again, as I said publicly in their statements, a desire to work with these institutions to actually remove some of that burden. Likely in a sign that they've even recognized that this is impacting some of the activity in those markets.
And George, is some of this also impacting underwriting for commercial loans? Is it harder to get a commercial loan right now, or is it relatively easier than it was a few years back?
That's a very good question, because we've tracked bank underwriting, and we've seen across the board bank underwriting loosen, 2011 to about 2015. At the small cap end, we've run this survey now for about 7 years of our members, based on which the report data stems. And what we noticed is that lending and underwriting standards, lending conditions have actually tightened. Last year, they tightened for about 33% of members. This year, those tightening of underwriting standards reached 37% of members. So obviously, the conditions are getting tighter.
And what would you expect moving forward for the next year or two related to underwriting and the impacts of these regulations on banks? What should practitioners think about headed our way?
So I think that at least for 2017, as I mentioned, regulators on one hand recognize that small community banks are having a hard time and actually are having higher costs just trying to comply with some of these regulations. So they are trying to improve that situation. But given all the other priorities on the administrative side, on the regulatory side, I expect this scrutiny to actually continue through the rest of the year. So I don't expect any easing in actual underwriting standards. What will happen in 2018, I think, largely depends on, number one, the level of economic activity, both globally and in the U.S. And number two, it will also depend on the actual market conditions in the U.S. So far, our members have actually reported cash flow, so the NOIs have been rising constantly over the past 6 to 7 years on commercial properties. So there's obviously not a cash flow concern as much. But obviously, banks are feeling a little heat.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens moving forward, and especially with rates, with the Fed raising rates, how that's going to impact commercial loan rates and borrowers, and ultimately how it may impact values and cap rates moving forward. So we're going to have to take a short break, and we'll get back. I'm going to ask George about that, and let's look at what rates might do moving forward. So stay with us. We'll be right back. I'm Michael Bull, and this is America's Commercial Real Estate Show.